I just need to do this. Yeah. As I said, it is work I've done with my PhD student Sven Ulbst here at Aarhus University. And the work is partially part of an EU project called Tier 2, which you probably, some of you know about. The talk will be quite specific, focusing on one aspect of open science, namely reproducibility. But you can consider this as a case study because other open science practices should also, in our view, be seen in relation to different modes of producing knowledge. We want to emphasize the respect for epistemic diversity when specific practices presumed to be superior or valuable for some goal are mandated or rewarded and eventually made normative across a vast range of research practices. That is, we see a tension between these one-size-fits-all approaches and the respect for epistemic diversity. And one way to examine to what extent such practices are indeed relevant and feasible is to examine them in relation to the specific knowledge production mode adhered to in a specific community. And I will try to introduce such a model, which we have developed in Tier 2, and present its analytical dimensions in this talk. And then I hope it's not too abstract, but then hopefully you can get see what we are aiming at with the model. Now, Tier 2 is one of 3 EU projects that was funded 2 or 3 years ago under the same call, addressing reproducibility. The others are OSIRIS and IRISE. And contrary to the other 2, our project focuses on epistemic diversity, at least to some degree. Some, especially psychologists, but also researchers in medicine and other social sciences, argue that we have a reproducibility challenges in these areas. Some even claim that there is a crisis. And one of the main pillars of the open science movement in these fields has been to promote more and better reproducibility and replication in general. Now, reproducibility is often seen as a vital part of the so-called scientific method, and thus a necessity for science to be self-corrective, credible, and cumulative. And for several reasons, replication activities of claims in previous papers have been very rare in these fields. In fact, what is incentivized when you submit a manuscript to journals is novelty and not replication studies. And the open science movement wants to change that and has proposed a strategy for culture change, which you can see in this pyramid, where eventually reproducibility practices could be made mandatory. And the question, of course, is for whom? Is it for everybody? And so forth. And we also know if it becomes mandatory, it's also, of course, an incentive, and it goes into the reward system of science. EU is also moving towards incentivizing or mandating open science practices, including reproducibility, or at least practices that will make your study open, transparent, and reproducible for others, whatever that implies. But if your way of producing knowledge, your knowledge production mode, as we call it, does not fit well with notions of a scientific method and the epistemic norm of reproducibility, then what? If we start with the terms reproducibility or replication, we could actually ask what they mean. And already there we get into confusions, which we have sort of outlined in a working paper in the project. I mean, it's quite clear what some understand and refer to as reproducibility, others called replication, and vice versa. And many have widely different views on what the concept actually entails. Nevertheless, I suppose we all have a sense of what this is about, something going from redoing something to transparency in order to get some kind of credibility around the claims we make. Across many fields and ways of knowing, be it quantitative, qualitative, or even theoretical, we argue that the Danish term efterprøvbarhed, or in German Nachprüfbarkeit, is what people generally think of when these terms are used in an ordinary sense. This would be essential to most ways of producing knowledge, from very different perspectives. But the term, however, does not exist in the same meaning in English, which is a huge problem. So the reproducibility of replication is in fact a much stricter concept with much stronger epistemic ties attached to the notion of the scientific method, which we should remember, even though we think we have this ordinary sense of what it means for many. And for the sake of argument here, I will hereafter use the term reproducibility. I could also have stated replication of both, but I stick to the former for simplicity. Now, this is just one among many illustrations, textbook illustrations of the scientific method. Indeed, many will say that there is no scientific method, and the scientific process is certainly much messier than depicted here. But it illustrates well, I think, some of the important components of this perceived scientific method. The cycles you have in here depict reproducibility as generic to the process, where and when it appears may, of course, differ considerably. For example, in some areas, reproducibility is an iterative, ongoing practice during the process, whereas in other areas, reproducibility is not necessarily seen as an iterative part of a particular research process, but as a study in itself. This is important because it raises questions about the function of reproducibility. Another generic and probably the most important element in the notion of a scientific method is the idea of an experiment, where the researchers can manipulate something to examine causality. Experiment and doing it again and again aligns well with the notion of reproducibility. So when we speak of the scientific method, and we do that a lot, we implicitly think of experiment and reproducibility as an epistemic norm. But in our view, this is way too simplistic. Experiments are not the same. We can project them according to how much degree of control they have over the subject matter they study. At the same time, we can also look at how strong or weak the theories are which we use to examine the subject matter. And things go together, of course. Strong theory makes strong predictions, and strong test, which creates more credibility and eventually accumulate knowledge. The point is that it is possible when the subject matter is less complex, as with inanimate objects in the natural sciences. Here, reproducibility is typically an iterative part of the scientific process, as shown in the previous slide. And reproducibility of published results are not only generally high, it is also seen as less relevant, as the claims already have high credibility and other elements are picked up by future research. This, however, is not the case when the complexity of the subject matter is high, as with animate objects, where theories are also often quite weak, as is most often the case in the social and behavioral sciences. Here we have a low degree of control and a high degree of what we call causal density, the many causes that could explain a result, which is difficult to handle exactly because we have this lower degree of control. We also have a scientific process that moves from A to B without internal reproducibility activities due to the ethical and practical challenges of experiments with humans, which means that reproducibility becomes an activity in itself after a result is published, and therefore reproducibility becomes a study in itself. And here it turns out that this activity is not only very low due to incentives, the results are seemingly also disappointing, or at least that depends on what you expect, but that has been the claim, at least for those who think we are experiencing a reproducibility crisis in some of these areas. We can therefore say that these different kinds of experimental approaches reflect different types of knowledge production. But we should also realize that many fields are not experimental, which is often forgotten when we use a scientific method as an ideal to explain the core elements of scientific research and epistemic norms. Reproducibility means different things and different implications for experimental and non-experimental research. We use the term knowledge production mode to encapsulate the way of organizing knowledge production within a domain or field, We often speak about fields or disciplines or method when we address issues of open science. For example, the notion of reproducibility might be problematic for the humanities or for qualitative research. However, we think it's more appropriate to speak of knowledge production modes because within a field, several different modes of knowledge production can be at work. And they most likely have different epistemic norms, which we should consider when we address issues of open science or even research evaluation. This is where epistemic diversity comes in. We therefore propose knowledge production modes as an organizing construct to situate, in this case, reproducibility within knowledge production's epistemic, social, and contextual conditions. Epistemologies determine the epistemic norms and criteria by which we assess knowledge claims, whereas social conditions influence how research is organized, practiced, rewarded, reported, and discussed. And contextual conditions put boundaries and restrictions in research, for example, due to the subject matter, the environment, the availability of resources and technologies, which are the local conditions of doing research. Together, these underpinnings of knowledge production have significant implications for the goals of the research, the epistemic values and norms adhered to, the type of knowledge that is produced, the quality and relevance criteria of the research, the theories, concepts, and measurements used, the methods and practices used, and the social and ethical implications of the research. Let's then look at the concerns of epistemic diversity in relation to this. We are certainly not the first to raise concerns about epistemic diversity when it comes to reproducibility or open science issues for that matter. A well-known example in relation to reproducibility is this categorization from Sabina Leonelli, who, as you may know, have published a very instructive introduction to the philosophy of open science. We are, however, not satisfied with this and similar approaches as they lack an epistemic dimension, which is very important if you want to examine to what extent reproducibility might be relevant. And they also focus on methods or research designs at a very general level and in a seemingly enumerative way, making the categorization quite closed. This is unflexible if you want to examine to what extent reproducibility is feasible for the different modes of knowledge production. Let's take an example from Leonelli. This brief example from her paper, what Leonelli subsumes under the broad category of standardized experiments, which is second highest in her rank order of reproducibility. This would entail that both clinical trials, drug trials, and high-energy physics experiments done in particle accelerators, as she explains in these quotes, would be the same. She argues that they both have a high degree of control and strongly rely on statistics as an inferential tool. She thereby assumes that the conditions for these experiments are the same and that they therefore operate in the same way, which means we can require and expect the same from them when it comes to issues of reproducibility. We disagree with this. We argue that these examples of standardized experiments are in fact quite different ways of doing experiments, as you can infer from the analysis according to these dimensions, which are actually the dimensions in our model characterizing knowledge production needs. If we look, for instance, at the subject matter, clearly this is different because in drug trials, we are testing it on humans, whereas in particle physics, we are doing with atoms, which means non-living things. And we can go on if we look at what we call the system of justification. I won't go into detail about this, but only state that this is tied to epistemology and thus reveal the epistemic functions and norms of the research. Here they are the same because both approaches align with the notions of the scientific method, and therefore reproducibility seems relevant because it underpins functions such as validity and reliability. But if we then look at the investigative setup, we can see that the degree of control is certainly not at the same level. And so it also goes with the methods, the technical task uncertainty. There's a huge difference in uncertainty when it comes to methods. And the same goes with theory. They actually do not rely in a similar way on statistical inference. And you can also say that the goals of the research is quite different. In fact, the drug trials are what we would call regulatory research, whereas high energy physics is basic research. And we could also frame it the notion of standardized experiments according to the previous slide, and see that these kinds of experiments are quite different, especially when it comes to the degree of control. So experiments in drug test and particle physics are not similar knowledge production modes. While reproducibility is relevant to both in an epistemic way, its feasibility is quite different. We should therefore not expect and require the same of these knowledge production modes. And we have therefore proposed an analytical model to be able to examine knowledge production modes. And what we aim for is to identify to what extent, in this case, the notion of reproducibility, whether it's relevant and feasible. I mean, something can be relevant, but it can also be quite unfeasible to do, and this should be reflected when we try to mandate or promote these issues. You can read more about the model in the paper that was referenced previously. Just a very brief thing about this awkward term system of justification. System of justification simply just refer to the frameworks, criteria, and methods used to justify scientific knowledge claims. And these systems determine what counts as valid, reliable, and warranted knowledge within different scientific traditions. And we could also call them epistemic functions, which we do. And knowledge production modes are often organized around specific epistemic functions. And as you can see from the example, there are many different epistemic functions, and not all of them align well with notions of reproducibility. And epistemic functions are first and foremost linked to epistemology and not methods. And let's try and look at an example of that. Here we will again see why knowledge production modes, in our view, is a more suitable construct than fields, designs, or methods. Consider this case of international relations, which is a field in the social sciences. Some would probably say it's a subfield of political science, but that does not matter. They have their own institutions, societies, and journals, and so forth. As you may remember from the model in the previous slide, epistemology is very important because here the basic epistemic functions and norms are defined for a particular kind of research. In this case, we have at least two main knowledge production modes in international relations. There are more, but these two are quite distinct because they both apply qualitative methods, but they differ in epistemology, one being positivistic, the other interpretivist. And as we have highlighted, the two different epistemologies value different epistemic functions and thus goals. Positivism, as you can see from the quote from one of the authors of this very popular textbook, endorses the notion of reproducibility, whereas interpretivism value other functions such as transferability, credibility, or Nachprüfbarkeit, which are different from functions underpinning reproducibility. Consequently, imposing the same norms of these knowledge production modes, basically practices that support reproducibility, would violate epistemic diversity and in fact coerce one dominant knowledge production mode on top of others, and thus creating a hegemony and in a negative sense. And as you can also see, this is a challenge even if the methodical approaches are similar. And notice, even if reproducibility is relevant for the qualitative positivistic researchers in international relations, the actual feasibility might be a challenge. And this leaves us with the final aspect of feasibility and the two pillars of our model. The relevance of reproducibility can be examined using elements such as goals, commercial or proprietary interest. Most clinical research have these limitations, which also spills over into demands for more openness, for instance. Epistemology and systems of justification are the other two elements of this pillar. Whereas feasibility and thus the restrictions or limitations to redoing something have to do with the nature of the subject matter, the necessary investments needed, and not least the methodological and theoretical uncertainties linked to knowledge production modes. It is much more difficult, or I could say it is easier to set up, describe and run an experiment where you drop inanimate objects in a vacuum chamber than gathering 50 patients and run one drop trial on them over a longer period, and then potentially run another trial later on a new set of patients and hope for a similar result. These are very different ways of producing knowledge, and please keep that in mind when you promise or mandate one-size-fits-all solutions to science. There are different ways of producing knowledge, and we should respect this epistemic diversity. Most knowledge production modes strive for Nachprüfbarkeit, but that is very different from reproducibility, which is closely tied to the notions of the scientific method and positivism. Thank you very much.